Welcome to Didactic, CAPS Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and other CAPS fellows study for their board exams. But anybody interested in human development or child and adolescent mental health will also get something out of this. I am using AI to assist me with the content creation. So for a rundown on how this podcast is produced, please see episode 1. All the content in this podcast should be considered my own opinion and no one else's. Even if it sounds like a fact, it's just my presentation of that fact. This is episode 6. In this episode, I cover Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory of development focuses on social and emotional aspects of human growth as they change from one stage of your life to a next. A child's cognitive development underlies what Erickson describes, and arguably without the cognitive skills that were described by Piaget in the last episode, the psychosocial stages that Erickson describes wouldn't even be possible. Piaget and Erickson are describing two different things that are very complementary. Erickson's stages emphasize an individual's main kind of psychological and social struggles that he calls conflicts that they experience as they age. Psychological conflicts are either resolved or not, and this has a lot to do with their interactions with their social environment. So it's very much a psychosocial formulation of development. Now, he proposes a more or less kind of binary solution to these crises at each phase of life. For example, a child either establishes basic trust in others and their needs are met, or they develop mistrust. And each of these outcomes will carry deep consequences for the future. Now, one can argue that these stages are vastly oversimplified, kind of like caricatures of human life, and they're really highly dependent on particular cultural factors. They were conceived of by a male in a male-dominated society, so they obviously have a strong gender bias. They also have a strong middle-class bias. Humans who are focused more on daily survival may not really match this kind of formulation. But as a general story of white middle-class Western male humans' psychological path through life, it's a compelling story. It is not, however, really that scientific, although it is based on a lot of observation and a lot of careful study. And what it does is provide clinicians kind of a way to help them construct a narrative of the patient's life with the patient so that they can understand how the patient got to where they are from where they were. Also, having stages like this make very easy board exam questions. So let's review them. Just like in the last episode, I'm going to start with a very quick breakdown of the stages and then go into a more deep dive. The first stage, trust versus mistrust. And this is from birth to 18 months. So the key issue here is, of course, developing trust in your primary caregivers. It's about attachment, really. And a positive resolution of this stage leads to a sense of security, a sense that the world is kind of a predictable place where you can trust things to happen for you. The people around you are worthy of trust. And this is essential for forming healthy relationships throughout life. The next stage, which is around 18 months to 3 years, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So this stage is all about developing a sense of independence, a sense of self-control and emotional regulation. Positive resolution of this stage fosters self-confidence and the ability to feel like you can make choices, you are allowed, and the choices you make can be good choices. And this leads directly into what is basically the preschool years, ages 3 to 5. And this stage is called initiative versus guilt. In this stage, kiddos develop a sense of purpose, a sense of initiative where they're becoming way more confident in their own ability to interact with the world by themselves. There's more autonomy here. And positive resolution of this stage leads to a sense of curiosity. Kids can become more creative, and they'll be willing to take on challenges. The next stage, industry versus inferiority, is from 6 to around 11 or 12 years of age. And during this stage, kids are developing a sense of competence and achievement. I can do it. It's possible. In fact, I can do more than one thing. I can do lots of things. So positive resolution of this stage fosters a sense of industry, where you can go out and just do things, and you have a pretty good expectation that they're going to succeed. So you don't fear applying yourself to various different tasks. Stage 5 is identity versus role confusion, and this is adolescence. So after you've developed the ability to do things, to believe in yourself, now you need to develop your own particular identity. And so this stage is really all about your identity and how you fit into the world. What is your role in this world? And positive resolution of this stage leads to a strong sense of self and the ability to form meaningful, long-lasting relationships and employment. After 18, all the way to about 40 years, is young adulthood, and that's called intimacy versus isolation. So here's where people develop these intimate, long-term relationships that were made possible by successfully completing all the other stages. They make a lot of connections with themselves, not only with family, but with more friends. Their friend group expands, and they become members of a community. Positive resolution of this stage leads to the ability to form these deep and loving relationships that are going to help them when they get old, basically. And that's stage 7, where you're starting to get kind of old, but you're not super old yet. And this is middle adulthood. It's from about 40 to 65 years. And Erickson calls the conflict here generativity versus stagnation. The main issue here for people is how they contribute to the next generation, relationships that they start to form with members of the next generations. And positive resolution of this stage leads to a real kind of sense of purpose and fulfillment through your work and your family and your community involvement. But then you do get old. And when you're over age 65, this conflict called integrity versus despair presents itself. You're so old now that you can't do as much as you used to, so you can't see your sense of identity in your work and contributions to the next generation, in the community, the same way you did before. There's more reflection now. And there's the acceptance of your impending death. So positive resolution of this stage leads to a sense that you are important because you have wisdom. A person is at peace, and they accept that they're going to die and that their life was meaningful. So that's all the stages of Erickson. Now let me go into a little bit more depth for each of the stages. Stage 1, trust versus mistrust, birth to 18 months. This is the first stage, and it's really the most crucial stage because it lays the foundation for everything that happens after this, especially someone's emotional well-being and their ability to interact in positive ways with others. So the central conflict is trust versus mistrust. An infant develops trust in caregivers, especially, but in the world in general, believing that their needs will be met, that the world is essentially a good place. Mistrust is when an infant's needs are not consistently met and they are not able to predict that their caregivers are going to always be there for them. They are unreliable or unresponsive. An infant develops a kind of desperate interaction with the world. So for positive resolution of this stage, there are some key things that caregivers can do. One is consistency. So reliable and consistent caregiving, it's really essential to trust. Infants need to know, and it needs to be predictable and always happen, that their caregivers are there for them when they need them. And caregivers also need to be responsive. So, not just there consistently, but also responding to the needs. Caregiving also needs to be sensitive to a child's needs. Caregivers should be attuned to an infant's cues. They need to be learning what an infant means when they are trying to communicate with the world, what all the little signals are. Now that they're consistent, responsive, and sensitive to their kiddos' needs, the interactions that they have with them need to be positive and encouraging. Things like cuddling and playing, smiling. All these things help infants to feel safe in the world, and it strengthens the bond between the infant and the caregiver. It fosters what later I'm going to talk about in other episodes with a very strong and secure attachment. After the stage trust versus mistrust comes autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is from 18 months to about 3 years, so this is the toddler stage. The central conflict here is balancing a desire for autonomy, to have the control over the world, with a fear of failure and disapproval from your caregivers who have actual control over your world. So positive resolution of this results in this sense where I can go out into the world, I can do things, I have confidence in myself, I can make choices, but I also can still rely on others. You develop this sense of confidence, and you're willing to make mistakes without feeling like the consequences of those mistakes are going to be dire. If you fail to resolve here, you're not going to have that much autonomy. You're going to become more dependent. You're going to be eaten up with shame, which is, I think Erickson described as like rage turned at yourself. You're going to doubt your ability to do things. In essence, you're going to have no self-confidence and no sense of self-efficacy. Factors that would contribute to a sense of autonomy in children are encouraging exploration, encouraging them to get out there and to make mistakes in a safe environment. So you provide them a safe environment and allow them to explore it and give them lots of ways to explore. The next is setting very clear limits. Very clear and consistent limits are super important because then children can understand boundaries and it will help them to develop a sense of self-control. They will overstep these boundaries and frequently, and if they can trust that you're going to pull them back and that they're going to encounter the same thing every time they go over that limit, but it's not like a dire thing. They're not screamed at, hit, abused. They're just put back in their place over and over and over again. That helps them to develop a sense of autonomy and helps them to be able to make that decision to stop themselves and not rely on somebody else to make it for them later in life. So it requires a lot of patience and kind of understanding on the side of the caregiver. They have to realize that it takes very consistent, long-term limit setting for them to become effective. And a lot of positive reinforcement too. So praising children's effort is super important. Showing them when they do something right, saying, "That's great. I really like that." This tells them what it is that they are doing that is right instead of what it is that they are doing that is wrong. It's not just no, it's yes and. So some things that could contribute to doubt are like overprotection, where you don't want your kid to get hurt. You don't let them explore the world too much. You don't give them challenges to overcome. You don't let them fail. They cannot develop a sense of self-efficacy or autonomy if they're relying on you all the time to make decisions for them. Another thing that could disrupt autonomy is excessive criticism. So just constantly criticizing. That's the no, don't, stop, wrong, instead of the positive aspects. So the negative feedback, if it is excessive and not balanced by a lot of positive feedback, can really damage a child's self-esteem. Punitive punishment as well tends to lead to shame and doubt and discourage autonomy. So really kind of harsh punishment, a lot of physical punishment, will instill fear. And for some parents, that's what they want. They're like, I want my kids to fear me. They want them to fear the hand of God. But this really undermines a child's sense of autonomy. And there are going to be consequences for that later in life. Another thing that can really undermine autonomy and lead to a lot of doubt, especially, are inconsistent expectations. So if your expectations as a parent are changing constantly, if you're not following the rules yourself, if you're changing the rules, if you're flying off the handle for little things one day and not the other, or if you let some things slide sometimes and not the other, you don't have these clear and consistent boundaries, then shame and doubt is the result of that. That is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Then from around 3 to 5 years is the initiative versus guilt stage. This is the third stage. And typically here, children develop either a sense of purpose, this sense of initiative where I can go do things, versus a sense of guilt or self-hatred. Here, kids are balancing the desire to go out and take their own initiative, decide what they want to go do and go do it, explore the world, versus a fear of themselves making mistakes, disappointing other people, feeling guilty about themselves all the time. So positive resolution results in this sense of purpose, curiosity. It's okay to fail. On the contrary, kids can develop a sense that pretty much anything you do is going to result in something bad. You feel guilty all the time, you doubt yourself constantly, and therefore you lack motivation. Factors contributing to initiative include encouraging curiosity in kids. Just like in the previous stages, we've got to keep that up. Let kids explore, let them have multiple interests. And here, 3 to 5, imaginative play or role playing is huge for kids because they can go through multiple different iterations of the world in an imaginative way and develop basically problem solving skills through play. So we got to continue the positive reinforcement. Praise children when they're doing good. Praise them for their accomplishments. When they're doing right, let them know that's great. But still continue to set clear limits. That can never stop. They have boundaries still that they can't cross. At this point, if you've been setting very clear limits, it's a lot easier to continue to set limits. And you may only have to set that limit once or twice. And the kid is like, okay, I get it. That's a limit. I'm not going to break that limit. Factors that would contribute more to guilt are, again, excessive criticism. If you're constantly criticizing a child during this stage, it's going to damage their sense of self-efficacy. I can't do things, therefore I shouldn't even try. Again, punitive punishments, anything kind of really harsh, just going to cause them to be afraid. Being over-controlling. So this is like being overprotective. There's really no better way to help foster a sense of dependence on others than to give me my meaning, direction, and worth to control everything that I do. So if you want your kid to be dependent on you for their self-worth, what they're going to do for life, then be over-controlling. And I know some parents actually want that, but it's going to result in a lot of guilt and shame. And also just a lack of encouragement altogether. So if a child fails and you don't encourage them to try again, then they're less likely to develop the sense that you can do something even after failure. So you criticize a lot, you punish them, you control them, you make all their decisions for them, and you don't encourage them. And that's going to develop a pretty guilt-ridden child. So that is initiative versus guilt, 3 to 5 years. The next is industry versus inferiority, and this is 6 to 12 years. Here, kids develop a sense of competence. They really start to get really good at things. Like, they're not just learning they can do things, but they're becoming almost like little experts at some things. And they're using that knowledge to go out and do other things. So the central conflict here is kind of this Balance between the desire to be productive, to be competent at stuff, and that fear of failure or like to being inadequate. Successful resolution of this stage leads to this sense of competence, to positive self-esteem, this sense of self-efficacy, and the willingness to apply oneself to multiple different kinds of tasks. Negative resolution here, and you feel inferior. You feel inadequate. And so, of course, kind of lack motivation, just like in the last stages. So the way to really encourage positive resolution of this stage is similar to the last, encouraging learning, but the learning is more complex now. You're providing opportunities for different kinds of learning and exploration of the world in a more complex way. So you're involving your kids in lots of different things to see if there are things that they find very interesting. So you do a little too much. You're that parent who gets criticized for putting their kid in everything, which probably isn't the best way to do it either. But you're giving them multiple options. You're showing them the world. And you're praising them for their achievements. Again. But here's where your expectations aren't just kind of boundaries. You have to set these really kind of realistic expectations for what your kid can accomplish in what period of time that they can accomplish them. And if these expectations are realistic, then this is going to help the kiddo to feel competent and industrious. Peer relationships during this stage start to gain more and more importance. Child self-esteem can be boosted when they see that they can do things that their peers can do. And even when they see that they can do some things better than their peers can do. They have strengths. Now, factors that are going to contribute to inferiority are things like negative comparisons. So comparing them to other kids, like, oh, they can do this, but you can't. You should be able to do this by now, but you can't. Things like that. Having these unrealistic expectations where you put your kid into something and you expect by, the first month that they should be nearly an expert at it. So you get frustrated and they see you're frustrated. And you're like, I'm not going to bring you back here if you can't show me that you can do this. Or another thing would just be like a lack of support. Like, kid wants to go out and explore the world and do things, but parents like, nah. Or like, you fail. That's not for you. That's too hard. So parents who don't encourage their kids or support them are going to contribute to their sense of inferiority. With regard to peers, things like bullying or rejection from peers can have a much larger impact now. It can really damage a child's sense of self-esteem, and so they don't try as hard, and so they don't develop that self-efficacy, that industriousness. And they start to feel like they're just not as good as everybody else. Because this is a child and adolescent psychiatry board exam review podcast, the next stage is going to be the last stage that I go into any deep detail about. And this is the identity versus role confusion stage. So this is adolescence, 12 to 18. But really we know it's more like probably 10 to 24 or 26. So during this stage, adolescents are exploring their own sense of self, and they're trying to develop a sense of self that's separate from other people, but at the same time that's congruent with society's expectations for them. They want to fit in, but they want to be unique. So the central conflict here for adolescents is that desire to explore these different identities, find their strengths, find things that they like, even change themselves, with this need to also establish a coherent and consistent sense of self and identity. So positive resolution at this stage will result in their ability to have lasting relationships in the future, having long-lasting careers in the future. And if you fail to develop a strong sense of identity here, this results in what Erickson calls role confusion. And it's really just uncertainty about how you fit in. Who am I in the world? So you may have difficulty forming intimate relationships, have difficulty sticking with things. So factors that can contribute to a strong sense of identity are, again, exploration and experimentation. And for adolescents, this can be things that parents don't want them to be exploring and experimenting with, right? Things like substances, sexual activity. But if you provide them with alternatives where they can really explore things and experiment with the world, then they're less likely to turn to these other things. Although they probably will try them out at some point, just to be realistic. Having positive role models can help a lot. So positive role models are this way for them to see themselves in others. Role models can provide guidance and support, but also they provide something that the child kind of envies, that they want. They want to emulate that. In addition to having at least one good role model, kids need other supportive relationships, especially with family and peers. If they don't have supportive relationships, it's really hard to figure out how they're going to fit into the world because no one's telling them where they fit in. Supportive relationships fill that role of positive reinforcement, but also they fill a role of, at a very basic level, giving someone the ability to do what they need to do, a place to live, someone to take them where they need to go, someone to pick them up when they're done, consistent meals, consistent expectations. These are all things that supportive relationships are going to provide that help them not only to be able to explore the world, but also to have a coherent identity when they're done. So factors that contribute to role confusion could be parental pressure to just do what the parents want, to not go out and explore their own interests or things that they don't even know might be an interest or not an interest. Here, they don't get to have their own identity. It's given to them by their parent. Having a lot of negative peer pressure can also be a problem. So if kids are around peers who themselves don't have all of the support that they need and are doing things, super risky things, who don't have values that are consistent with what that person's family and other friends have, that can be very confusing for them. They're going to be questioning their identity. Also having a lack of guidance and support. So if you don't have that role model, if you don't have those people to go to, then your peers become more important. It's like a vacuum that they fill. So if you want these negative peer pressure to come in, then that's far more likely if someone doesn't have positive adult role models. And then there are cultural factors. And for every culture, this is different, but for things like immigrant culture, in depending on where you're at, or the split between the culture of the place that your parents came from and the place that you were born, and you want them to understand, but they don't, this can have a lot of impact, especially on an adolescent when they're trying to decide what their identity is going to be. And they can be torn between both of these things. So to summarize real quick, we have a total of 8 stages, of which I went through the first 5. So the first stage, trust versus mistrust, birth to 18 months. Second stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, 18 months to 3 years. Third stage, initiative versus guilt, 3 to 5 years. Fourth stage, industry versus inferiority, 6 to 11 years. And then the final stage, as far as child and adolescent psychiatrists are concerned, is the fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, and that's from about 12 to 18 years. So I'm leaving out intimacy versus isolation and generativity versus stagnation, as well as integrity versus despair, just because I don't have time to go into all those right now. And I want this podcast to be more specifically about kids and adolescents. So at this point, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do next. But I know that I have multiple projects kind of open and halfway complete. So I'll try to get to that. Right now it is the holiday season, so it may take me longer to get that out than I normally would. But I want to thank you for listening to this. And until next time, I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.